hear me. Again, yes, hi, thank you for having me. My name is Kalyn, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Maine Bumble Bee Atlas, which is a citizen science project through the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, partnership with University of Maine. But first, a little bit about my talk tonight. So first, I'm going to start talking about bumblebee ecology, which includes details about their life cycle and their role in pollination. I'll talk about the different bumblebee species in Maine. A lot of people tend to think that bumblebees are just the big yellow and black things that fly around, but we actually have quite a few species here in Maine. And I'll go into some conservation issues. You've probably heard about native bee declines, and I know I saw some questions for our participants tonight about it. And then I'll go into what is citizen science, and then I'll introduce the Maine Bumble Bee Atlas and go through what our objectives of that project were, as well as what results we have to date. So the first thing I want to bring up is it bumblebee or is it bumblebee? So you might have seen it written both ways, as one word, as two words. Same thing with honeybee. And this is a graph from Google that just shows usage through popular literature through time. So as you can see, bumblebee as two words was actually the predominant way to spell it. And then bumblebee as one word became much more popular, especially in the last 20 years or so. And one answer I found when I tried to find out the answer, because if you look up articles about bumblebees, you'll even see that scientists will use it as one word or two words. Sometimes the difference between whether they're in America versus Europe. And one answer is if the insect is what the name implies, you write the word separately. So like a housefly is a fly, but if run together, if not. So like butterfly or a dragonfly. So just something I came across in my own research. I was always curious because I started using it as one word and I switched to two words. But that brings us to who are the bumblebees? Bumblebees are insects, and they're in the order Hymenoptera, which includes the bees, the wasps, the ants, and the sawflies. And that's over 150,000 species. And then you can further break it down to families. So that's the family of Apidae, which has about 25,000 species. And then you can kind of break it down to splitting between honeybees, which is what a lot of people think of when they hear the word bee. And then bumblebees. And as probably many of you already know, honeybees are not native to Maine, and they're not native to North America at all, actually. They were brought over about 400 years ago. But bumblebees are native bees. And you may or may not be hearing my children in the background. Just those are mine. So the Bumblebee Lifecycle. So we are here, hopefully we are here in spring anyway. And that's when mated queens first emerge from hibernation. And at this point, they're essentially solitary. You'll see them, they're really big and fat. They're about the size of your thumb. If you have rhododendrons or amaryllis outside your house, that's especially where you'll see them. These queens in Maine will emerge in sometimes late March, but more likely mid-April, even late April or May, depending on the weather. So these big queens emerge from their winter diapause, and they've already mated. And what they do is they spend that springtime foraging, and they're looking for nest sites. So if you ever see a big fat queen who's searching along the ground, poking into little holes into roots, she's looking for a suitable nest site. And when she's chosen a nest site, she'll lay her eggs, and she'll rear that first crop of female workers on her own. And once they emerge, they'll take over from her, and she'll stay in the nest for the rest of her life until the fall time. So those first crop of workers, because they were taken care of by the queen by herself, they're kind of really tiny. So she'll stay in the nest from there on out. And then sometime in late summer, fall, really depends on the weather, but also which species you're looking at. New queens will emerge, as well as males, and males come from unfertilized eggs, and they'll disperse from that colony, and they'll mate with males and queens from other colonies. And the entire group of them will die out with the first couple frosts, except for those new queens who have mated with males, hopefully from other colonies. And then they start the whole process over, and they usually overwinter under the soil, under some loose soil. So hopefully we'll be starting to see queens, depending on the weather, in the next couple of weeks here. And a little bit about bees, around 6% of bee species are what we consider to be social bee species. The rest are solitary. So all those, if you've ever heard somebody say like orchard bee, mason bee, those tend to be more solitary bee species, like a ground bee. But here are some classifications that, which are the definition of what makes a bee eusocial. So an overlap of generations. So in this graphic here, that big bee right there in the middle who's sitting on top of that brood clump that's laid eggs in those nectar pots, that's the queen. And then all around her are smaller daughter workers from fertilized eggs. In those daughter workers, they have cooperative brood care. So they help take care of the eggs the queen has laid. And there's a division of labor. So some of those bees will take care of the eggs. Some of them will go out and be foragers. Some of them will be defense bees. And with bumblebees, that those roles can be very fluid and usually depends on age. In size in some species as well. And now that we're getting towards spring, we're going to start to see some flowers. So the willows and the maples will go fairly soon. So we can talk about the ecological role of pollination, which is essentially just moving of pollen grains between two flowers of the same species, either using animals or wind. And about 9/10 of all flowering plants need animal pollinated fertilization, and the predominant animal pollinators are bees. So you can think of it as 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you take depends on a bee, essentially. And these pollinator services can be hard to quantify for us, but they're valued in the hundreds of billions of dollars each in the United States, especially in the big cropping systems. Like you think of the almonds of California, you think of our wild Maine blueberries. And here are just some examples of different bee pollinated species right here. And we'll see our apples pretty soon. So if you're looking for those big queens, look in your apple trees, look in the blueberries. So those early blossoming flowers will house those blueberry queens for pollination. So bumblebees are large-bodied and furry. We know that. Those hairs that cover the surface of their body, they're individually branched hairs, which are really, really good at collecting pollen and having pollen essentially stick to them. There was a study a couple of years ago that also showed that as bumblebees fly, they can build up a positive charge on all over that hair. And if flower pollen has a negative charge, it actually helps the pollen stick to the bee. That hair is also really good at insulating the bee and helping it fly in cooler weather. Bees, like all insects, are essentially cold-blooded. They're not like mammals where we can keep our body temperature inside much warmer than our outside temperature, but bumblebees can actually heat up their hemolymph, which is essentially what insect blood, by vibrating their muscles. And that can help them fly in much cooler temperatures than an animal such as a honeybee could do. So they're really good at being in cooler climes. So they can be in higher altitudes. They're in the Himalayas. They're in high mountain ranges. Bumblebees are a temperate species. And in the last 30 years or so, they've actually become very important commercial pollinators. So a lot of people think of commercial pollination, you're breeding all these honeybee hives from crop to crop. But now we can rear bumblebee colonies and put them out into fields as well. They're not so much used in fields as they are actually in greenhouses, because they're very good at pollinating things like tomato and pepper. So you could put one of those boxes of bumblebees inside a greenhouse and they'd go wild. This is an example of a behavior that bumblebees do called buzz pollination, which is also known as sonication. And what they can do is, this is a bumblebee worker who is gripped onto the anthers of this flower, and she's vibrating her thoracic, so her wing muscles, which are in the middle part of her body where her wings are attached. She's vibrating those muscles at such a frequency that it's causing the anthers to release the pollen. And I think about 6% of all plant species have these anthers that are called porocidal, because you can think of them like salt shakers, where the anthers where the pollen is stored releases the pollen through little slits in the end of the anther. But bumblebees are really good at vibrating those anthers to a point where they actually release that pollen. In this image, you actually see it really well. So this, I'm not sure if you can actually see me and me pointing, but that round yellow blob is a pollen stuck to her corbicula, which is a pollen basket on her leg. Honeybees do not buzz pollinate. So bumblebees, there are only 250 species worldwide. 46 of those are in North America, and 17 or 18 have historically been found in the state of Maine. And this is a diversity heat map. So the warmer the color, the more species are found in that area. So Maine is pretty diverse when it comes to bumblebee species. You can kind of think of it as we have like 7% of all species found in the entire world here in Maine. The mountain ranges in the west have the highest diversity, but then those warmer areas like Texas and Florida have the lowest diversity, which is kind of opposite of what you think of when you think of most animal and diversity increasing toward the equator. Here are all the bumblebee species of Maine. So I put the common name at the start, and then I have the Latin name, so the genus and the species name after. Some of you may have heard of Bombus affinis, which is the first federally listed bee species under the Endangered Species Act of the United States. That was in 2017. And a bee that was just recently considered for listing was the yellow-banded bumblebee, which is a close relative of the rusty patch. They're in the same subgenus, and that's Bombus terricola, and that's one we actually have quite a good number of in Maine. So I've highlighted those two as ones to keep in your mind. And for those of you who have been following bee news, this is the rusty patch bumblebee, the one that's been pretty famous in the bee world for the last couple of years. And the graphic on top is just really great at showing what was once a really wide range for this bee and how it shrunk in the past 20 years or so. You can see that it's really stuck in the Midwest. That one little spot in Virginia was, I think, from only one specimen that was collected in the last 5 years. So there not a great representation. Its range has shrunk an estimated 87%. And of course, the rusty patch bumblebee is so named because if you look down at the lower left, you'll see there's a beautiful little reddish orange patch on that bee's back. And there's a great website, so I was talking about resources, called bumblebeewatch.org, which is sort of like iNaturalist, where you can take a photo of a specimen and submit it, and then professionals will actually look over your photo and identify it to species. And this is a Bombus affinis with a rusty patched occurrence map from that website. And you can see it's really concentrated in that area in the Midwest, although there is one spot in Maine, and that's from this picture here on the right, taken by one of our Bumble Bee Atlas volunteers, although she's not sure exactly when she took it, but it was definitely over 10 years ago. This is the last confirmed sighting of Bombus affinis in Maine, a place where it used to be quite common. The yellow-banded bumblebee, here's its historic range on the left, so named because it has that very prominent yellow stripe on the back of its abdomen, so that the bottom part of its body, essentially. And here's where that range has gone to now. As you can see, it seems to have shifted northward, but we actually still have quite a good representation of that species here in Maine that we found through the Bumble Bee Atlas, and I've seen that in my own collections as well. And a little bit about me switching between the common name and the species name. Common names can be confusing. There can be a lot of different common names for the exact same animal. Two animals that are different species can share the same common names, so we tend to say it's better to stick with the genus and species. So all bumblebees are in the genus Bombus, which means buzzing. And then just as an example, this is a Bombus ternarius, which is a fairly common bumblebee once you get Augusta northward, I would say. I live in Brunswick. I've seen it once or twice down here, but it's very common down east and in central Maine. And this is just showing this bee has a very prominent widow's peak, a backwards widow peak, going toward the back of its body. So if you ever see, a lot of people tend to see this bee and say, oh, I've seen the rusty patch bumblebee. I have so many of them in my yard. It's actually this bee right here, this Bombus ternarius. So very different from the rusty patched. And then I'll talk a little bit about the diversity of Maine's bumblebees. They come in more than just yellow and black in different patterns. We tend to identify bumblebees based on their color patterns. So we call them morphologically monotonous, which means that they all kind of are shaped the same. They've got a head where their antennae and eyes are. They've got that thorax, which is the middle part where the legs and wings are attached. And then they have their abdomen, which is the end part. Bumblebees, though, can be a little bit fluid depending on species, and that comes to that pattern. So it's not always foolproof. It's always easiest for us to get that bumblebee under a microscope or actually have the specimen in hand to accurately identify it. There is some mitochondrial DNA identification that happens where you can take a leg clipping to use DNA to identify them. But this is just showing you that not all bumblebees look the same. So the current status of our bumblebees is that, yes, some are in decline, which you've probably heard through the news or you've seen articles or people have posted on social media, but not all bumblebees are in decline. So there are certain species that are in decline and then others that are doing fairly well. Their populations are stable or even increasing. So this is a paper that came out about 10 years ago now, and it's showing different bees throughout the United States, different bumblebees, and how the relative abundance, which means how common they were in the population, has been shifting. So for instance, the rusty patch bumblebee is that first bee on the left, and that red arrow indicates it's been going down based on museum specimens comparing to recent collections. But other bees like Bombus bimaculatus, the two-spot bumblebee, is actually increasing in numbers. And one of the things that the authors in this study found that a lot of people have been pursuing is that populations that were in decline actually had higher levels of this microsporidian pathogen called Nosema bombi, which is a fungal pathogen. But we're not quite sure because it seems as if Nosema bombi affects different species in a different way. So that's still something we're kind of trying to suss out in the science world. So these dramatic declines were first seen in the 1990s. So it's been a couple of decades now. These declines have not only been seen in Maine and the United States, they've also been seen in Europe. So we see once common species now being more rare, and then other species becoming increasingly common. And there are some species that haven't been seen in Maine, like Bombus affinis, the rusty patched, that may actually be extirpated from the state, meaning that it no longer occurs here. And then 4 of the rarest species in the United States are considered to be native to Maine, which are the 4 species on the bottom here. I want to point out the Ashton's cuckoo bumblebee. If you've ever heard of the cuckoo bird, who lays her eggs in other birds' nests, that's what a cuckoo bumblebee does. They're in a different subgenus, but they're still in the genus Bombus. And these bees will lay their eggs in other bumblebees' nests and essentially take over. So the Ashton's cuckoo bumblebee preys upon the yellow-banded and the rusty patched bumblebee. So if their populations are in decline, it would make sense that their cuckoo bumblebee is as well. And then looking at the status of bumblebee species just in Maine, it really came up that a lot of the data that was there was deficient. There wasn't enough to actually list any bees statewide. There was no baseline. Nobody had done like a statewide monitoring. We had a lot of state records in terms of University of Maine, different colleges, the museum in Augusta had some records too. So we didn't really have any data on diversity or distribution or abundance, so you couldn't really make any recommendations in terms of monitoring future trends or how to list a bumblebee species yet. So that's why we came to say we really need something to look at the status of bumblebees in Maine. And I know that some of you sent in questions beforehand asking why are bumblebees in decline, so what are some threats? And this is just a quick rundown. The short of the long story is that it is most likely a combination of these threats and not just a singular threat. So for instance, diseases that are being spread through commercial bumblebees to wild populations is one of the things that's been posited, but maybe those wild bees are more susceptible to getting more sick from diseases because of pesticide use. So there's one pesticide that you may have heard of, this class called the neonicotinoids or the neonicotinoids. And it's a systemic pesticide that's actually taken up by the plant. So it goes out not only in the fluids of the plant, which is great for killing off sucking insects like thrips, but also in the pollen and nectar, which exposes bumblebees more likely not to a lethal degree of pesticide, but enough to maybe cause some confusion. Maybe they're not as great at foraging, or they have a shorter lifespan, which can lead to less reproductivity at the end of the season, which is leading to population declines. So habitat loss, fragmentation, the more pavement there is, the fewer wildflowers, and bumblebees are central place foragers. They really only go a kilometer usually around their colony in order to forage for pollen and nectar. And then there's been some climate change, so it doesn't seem like bees are able to move northward as some areas becoming warmer. There's a researcher who used to be at UNH, I'm not sure actually where she is now, I think she's in Canada, was looking at Terricola and how it was actually seemed to be climbing in altitude in New Hampshire. But also in Maine, we have pretty wet springs at this point, and they seem to be becoming more higher precipitation events. And if the weather is too bad in the springtime and the queen can't get out to forage for her colony, it leads to reduced colony success if she's stuck in her colony if the weather is too bad. So a little bit about the Maine Bumble Bee Atlas. It was initially started as a 5-year project from 2015 to 2019. We actually had volunteers that we trained back in 2018 still continue to give data this past summer as well. So we're still collecting data for this project. And so what is citizen science? So it's participation between scientists and non-scientists, where the non-scientists are actually able to collect authentic data that can be used to inform decision-making. And this is great when you need data on a large scale, such as population trends, whether it's temporally or whether it is a large area. Maine is huge. We have a lot of different habitats, different altitudes. So the more eyes looking for something, so if you're looking for a rare species like Bombus affinis, 5 Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife biologists versus 400 trained volunteers, you can guess who might have the better luck. And this is a group of I think this is from one of our first trainings back in 2015 on the University of Maine campus, and we're catching queens on that rhododendron there. We had 2 major objectives for the project. The first was to increase the scientific knowledge and distribution of the different species around Maine, but also to raise public awareness and support for the native pollinators and their conservation. So to get people interested in a topic, you include them in that research. In a partnership with Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, University of Maine, and then University of Maine at Farmington, and then a nonprofit called NatureServe that does species assessments. And if you're interested in Maine citizen science, there are a lot of different projects that have happened and are still happening around the state. Some of you may have been involved in these. For instance, the Maine Butterfly Survey, Ron Butler was one of the people who worked on the Maine Bumble Bee Atlas, but also did that as well. And they actually found 1 new US record from those volunteers. So that was pretty incredible. And then through the Maine Dragonfly and Damselfly Survey, they found that over 35% of all damselfly and dragonflies in North America have been found in Maine. And what's ongoing right now is the Maine Bird Atlas. So if you're interested, I included a link to the Maine Bird Atlas on there. So there are a lot of benefits to the Maine Bumblebee survey. So we increase the information we have about distribution, relative abundance, also phenology. So that's the timing of when a species will emerge. So for instance, Bombus bimmaculatus, the 2-spotted bumblebee, will come out fairly early, whereas we won't see higher levels of other species until much later in the season. And it's also temporal. So we start collecting in 2015, we can look at weather trends. There's a lot of different things we can pull out of that collected information. So there are different benefits. One of them is increasing the odds of finding rare species, looking for that needle in a haystack because we have more eyes looking. And then there's also this concept of experiential learning. So you raise public awareness of and support for native pollination conservation by involving non-scientists in their conservation efforts. And here are our volunteers, very proud to have collected a bumblebee queen. And that is a urine cup. That is something that I find quite useful in my collections. And this is an example of how we train our volunteers. So our volunteer trainings consisted of an 8-hour-long workshop. And this is, so we would spend the morning doing the fun stuff, talking about bumblebee biology, much as I've done with you. And then we have lunch break where we feed them a fantastic local lunch, depending on where we are. We did these workshops around the state of Maine, up in Orono, down in Gorham. We did one in Holton. And then we talk about surveying methods. Because in order for the data to be useful, it has to be collected in a uniform way. You can't just go out and collect bees and just hand them over. So these are survey data. Let's see. So here are volunteer workshops. So 8 hours, usually in a classroom. We gave our volunteers everything they would need to go out into the field and collect their bumblebees. So net collections were very common. A lot of people like to use those urine cups. We gave them coolers with ice packs because if you catch live bees, the best thing to do is to stick them back in the cooler. We instructed our volunteers to put bees, if they were collecting them, as voucher specimens, which means to give to us, in the freezer. That's the easiest way to preserve them. And here's an example of the collection methods collection sheet. One of the neat things about this, they took over from other projects they've previously done, is they use a Delore map page and grid. So some of our volunteers are kind of tech savvy and were able to use their phones to pinpoint their coordinates of where they had collected a certain voucher specimen. But others, they could open their Delore map and put down the page and then the grid of where they were to give us an idea too if they weren't able to find those coordinates. And this is just information about those site visits. And because every voucher specimen, so everything that's collected had its own unique ID number, we encourage people to make a guess of what species they had collected. And then once that data was published on our website, they could go back and compare it to what they thought that bee was. And from this, we actually had a few different training workshops that kind of merged out of these workshops where I did bumblebee ID. So taught people how to ID their own bumblebees just for the sake of learning how to do it, because a lot of people were interested. We did have volunteers who decided not to collect voucher specimens because when you collect a voucher specimen, of course, it dies. So we did have volunteers. Here's a great picture of a bee in a glass petri dish who decided to collect bees and just take photo vouchers so we can ID the bee species from a photo. And then we had our volunteers pin our voucher specimens there on the upper right. You can see a pinned box where each bee is connected to its voucher number. And then all of those bees were sent to a colleague named Leif Richardson in Vermont, who was contracted to do all the identification for us to keep it a very streamlined process. Here are some volunteer resources and outreach. We have a participant handbook, which has been evolving as the years go on, especially because in the middle of our project, we had a federally listed species, the Bombus affinis, that we had to worry about. So some parts of Maine were actually blocked off from collections to avoid. We didn't want our participants to, like, by accident collect a rusty patch bumblebee species because that's against the law. And if you have more questions about that, I can hopefully answer them. But we have a great website where Ron Butler updates all the data that's on there. We have maps on there. I run the Bumblebee Atlas Facebook page and I write blogs sometimes. So if you're interested, you can follow our Facebook page. I post bee news. And a little bit about who we had as our volunteers for the Maine Bumble Bee Atlas. The first couple of years, I gave a survey to our members. And for instance, I asked them what they believe were the possible threats to bumblebees. So here's just a quick graph showing what people thought were more likely to be threats to bumblebees. And also that pie chart on the right is showing their age. So unsurprisingly, a lot of our volunteers were of retirement age. We had a few teachers, but for the vast majority, we were over the age of 50. And some preliminary results from the 2015 to 2019 was that we had 8 training workshops, and we also did 3 bumblebee species ID workshops. So we trained over 330 volunteers. And a little over half of those contributed data, which is pretty consistent when you compare with other citizen science projects. So all 16 counties were accounted for, 500 townships. And in this last year, this 2020, we asked people to focus on the townships that were less represented. So as you can imagine, like the Portland area, the Brunswick area, the Orono area were all very well covered, but we're missing a lot of the Western Maine mountains. Over 24,000 vouchers were submitted. And then there were 3 invasive or new species to Maine that we were also watching for, and all 3 of those were found. And that's the European wool carder bee, which is that bee on top. And I know here in Brunswick, we have a lot of them if you see them buzzing around your flowers. The lower right is the eastern carpenter bee, which has been making its way north. And then the giant resin bee, the Asian giant resin bee, there on the bottom left. So all 3 of those were also found here. And then this is a preliminary result graph showing historical relative abundance versus what we found in 2015, 2016. So those orange lines are how common that bee used to be. So for instance, Terricola on top, that yellow banded bumblebee, made up about 40% of all museum specimens from before the year 2000. And then it only made up about 10% down to 5% in 2015, 2016 collections. But then you can compare that to a bee like Bombus impatiens, which is the common eastern bumblebee, which is also incidentally the species that's used in commercial pollination. And that relative abundance has actually increased. So we're seeing that same dynamic that's happening where some species are actually increasing and some are decreasing. I put the yellow stars next to bumblebee species that are in the state historical record, but that have not been found yet by the Bumble Bee Atlas or in any recent surveys. Oh, and then I just made so those red arrows mean decreasing relative abundance because we didn't find any Bombus affinis, which is that starred bee, the rusty patched at all. And then one of the highlights of our project has been the discovery of a Bombus ashtoni population in northern Aroostook County. This bee hadn't been found in New England for I'm not sure how many years, but it was definitely at least 10. And this is that cuckoo bumblebee I mentioned that its host species are the rusty patch bumblebee and the yellow banded bumblebee. So to find this bee is a good sign. And this bee has been notably identified as being in decline. So we did find it in the upper tippy top of Maine, which is incredible because it's definitely a small population, but it's there. And I like to throw this map up there. So that map on the left is showing a pre-Maine Bumble Bee Atlas map of confirmed species by township. And then you can see how much more ground we've covered in the 5 or 6 years since we started the Bumble Bee Atlas. So a lot more coverage of the state, a lot more townships covered. One thing I will note is that our volunteers had a special license. I'm not sure what the name of that is, but they could collect in all public lands in Maine. So they couldn't collect in Acadia because that's federal land. And they also could not collect in Baxter because that takes a special certification. And I'm going to wrap it up here so we can do some Q&A, but I just want to quickly do some acknowledgements. The project funding for the Bumblebee Atlas, if you do the chickadee checkoff on your tax returns, if you own a loon plate, some of that money went to the this project. The State Wildlife Grant Program, the Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund was where we also got funding. University of Maine also some help from there. The staff includes Beth Swartz, who is the coordinator at the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, myself, Lee Richardson in Vermont, and also we had some partners and advisors. And to kick off the question and answer session, I do have a couple of resources here because I saw a few folks did ask about different resources. And this guide on the left is not just about bumblebees, it's actually the bees in your backyard. So there are over 20,000 native bee species around the world, and over 400 of those occur in New England, and over 278 probably species occur in Maine. That's just from the latest checklist by Frank Drummond and Alison Dibble. But this is a wonderful resource, great, breaks down bees by genus, talks about different behaviors, lots of beautiful photos, and the authors are wonderful, very knowledgeable. And then this identification guide on the right is purely for North American bumblebees, so it has 46 species in it. And then if you're at all interested in Bumblebee ID, it does have a dichotomous key in the back, which is kind of the choose your own adventure. So you kind of have to know what the different anatomical parts are. But this is a really great guide to all those species. And that is my piece of the presentation. So I'm happy to answer questions or try to.
Great, thank you so much, Kalyn.
Yeah, that was really wonderful. Thank you. So we do have a couple questions. Someone asked, what's considered the best bumblebee habitat?
So that's another thing about bumblebees is because of their life cycles where they have those solitary queens that come out in the spring, and then the colonies that have to build up as the season progresses, is they actually need a few different kinds of habitats. So they'll need good nesting habitat for the queens. I think like tussocky grasses, like loose grasses, like longer grasses. Queens, you'll probably they like loose soil. And then you also need good nesting sites for those colonies, which is different from where the queen's going to overwinter. Anecdotally, it seems like they like old rodent nests. So bumblebee queens don't do their own digging when they find a nest. They just kind of look for cavities in the ground and choose what they like. I had one in a rodent's nest in my shed. They also have been known to like even house themselves in old junk cars, like the soft piece of the seats. The attics. I have found a few different nests in like the crooks of like the tree roots, like that soft area where it's all mossy. Maybe it was a chipmunk or squirrel nest at one point. And then also for habitat, you'll find them not really in the woods, but a lot of them on like the wood edge, because they need to be near foraging material. So where where wildflowers are. And they're also, the colonies are long lived. So if the queen emerges in March or April, more likely, and they don't die off until October where they get that frost, they really need an area where they have access to foraging the entire time. So as you know, a lot of flowers will bloom at certain points in the year. So an area that has a lot of high diversity of flowers that they can forage on is also key.
Awesome, thank you so much. Someone asked about photography tips for taking pictures of bumblebees. Do you have any advice for how to take better pictures?
There are a lot of different resources online, and I think the bees in your backyard might also have some photography tips. Micah. We also have tips on our website, the Maine Bumble Bee Atlas website. Child. But that's more for taking photos when it comes to wanting to identify them to species. There are a lot of, I would say there's probably a lot of great, like Alex Wild is a wonderful insect photographer. He does a lot of work online. He also he's in Texas. And I bet he has resources. If you were to Google his name, Alex Wild Insects, as an idea of how to take better, because bees are difficult, I would say, the way that they move. You would need a wonderful camera that can capture movement and without blur. I just use my cell phone, but it's not always the best.
We had a couple questions about collecting. So one person asked, why are you collecting queens? And another one asked, why do they need to be pinned?
So we don't, so the Bumblebee Atlas, we do not ask our participants to collect queens. The queens that we were collecting in the training were all released. It's a great point, because if you think about it, if you collect a queen, essentially you are ending that colony's life cycle. it's hard to say what the actual success rate is for queens to found a colony that is then goes on to become successful with workers and then produce males and or queens and males at the end of the season. But no, we do not ask our participants to collect queens for research. And for pinning, it is very important to have actually a voucher specimen in hand. And I know a lot of people are concerned, well, if bees are in decline, then why are we collecting and killing these animals? But a bee life cycle is very short. I think it's maybe 2 to 3 weeks in the field for a worker. So losing one worker to a collection probably is not a big deal. We encourage our volunteers not to collect a bunch of the same species from one spot. So for instance, if you're in a patch of dogbane and there's a ton of Bombus ternarius, so the orange-banded bumblebee on there, they're probably from the same colony. So we ask people you don't need to collect all of those. That is not needed, but it is, in entomology, we really do need the voucher specimens for record keeping.
Neat. Somebody asked about bee blocks.
So bee blocks, they're kind of in vogue. You might find them at Home Depot or Lowe's in the garden section, and they're essentially these little houses that have straws you can put in, and a lot of solitary bee species will lay their eggs in them, like orchard bees, so the osmia bees. And what I will say is I'll direct you to someone named Kalyn Bickerman-Martens. And he's kind of got he's got this wonderful blog about what makes a good bee block versus a bad bee block. Because if you're not good at cleaning out your bee blocks, it can grow fungus. You can actually attract parasites, and it can be bad for those bees. So that's, I can send this to you too, Becky. It's a wonderful blog that he wrote on how people should build those bee blocks and how to take care of them. And those are really important parts, rather than just have it be like oh, this is cute. And they just kind of put it up and forget about it. You can't really do that with those and be responsible about it.
That's really helpful to hear. Thank you. That'll be an exciting resource to see more about. We had a couple questions about what people can do. So someone asked, what can the average citizen do to promote bees and foster bee health? And another person mentioned that they have a large tract of land and they want to know what they can plant to attract or support bumblebees.
Yeah, there are so many great resources now. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation is a really good resource. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, also you can put in where you live and it will give you good native plants and when they bloom. So essentially, I suggest looking for native plants and also a variety of bloom times to make sure that you have enough forage resource through the entire lifespan of that colony. But those are two wonderful resources that I absolutely recommend. There's also, is it NRCM? But I would start with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation and the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center.
Somebody just put in the Cindy is dropping some more links in the chat just to alert people the Wild Seed Project and the NWF Native Plant Finder. Mm-hmm.
That's a great one.
We had one question about changes in distribution. So someone asked, they said historically Maine was completely forested. Was the distribution of bee species different then than now? How has that changed over time?
It's hard to say exactly how it's changed because, as I said, dense forests aren't really great bee habitat because they really do need a lot of forage materials, but not to say that you wouldn't find bumblebees in a forest. I would say when it came to humans cutting fields and making agriculture, that definitely changed things because you have more field edges. We have a lot of ornamental plants as well. So like, people who plant rhododendrons or foxglove by their house, it's definitely changed the distribution of those species because we've impacted the landscape quite a bit. There's a really great website too. I want to say, I'll have to send it to you, Becky, but One of my colleagues at UMaine, Brianne, did this project called the Bee Mapper, where you could use GIS and actually look at like the suitability of your habitat site and its ability to support bees, depending on the bee species, whether it's solitary, bumblebee, honeybee, which might be a cool tool to play around with. I think it was more produced as a tool for blueberry growers or other crop growers to kind of figure out, because you may have heard of people like planting like pollinator plantings next to their fields, their crop fields. So for instance, a blueberry grower who wants to promote native bees in his or her field, blueberry blooms in May. So you wouldn't want to plant something competing with their crop because you really want the bumblebees to visit your crop. But what you could do is do a pollinator planting that then blooms the rest of the summer and supports those bees throughout the rest of the year.
We had one question, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get it quite right, but I think that somebody was asking how they could learn more about the bees in their county in Maine and kind of the history of those bees and how those populations have changed over time.
So there is a checklist of native bee species in Maine that was published, I think, in 2018 by Frank Drummond and Allison Dibble, which does break down, I think it is by county, if that's something they want to look into. It's I'm not sure you can download it, but I think if you Google like bee checklist of Maine, it will pop up. On our website for Maine Bumble Bee Atlas, we actually have it broken down by county, what species are there, what bumblebee species, not native bees. But also iNaturalist is a really wonderful tool as well, that you can actually look up species and see where they appear in your state. So you can see if they're nearby you. And then there's bumblebeewatch.org, where you can also look up where bees have been spotted in your area.
Kalyn, would you mind going back to, somebody had asked about the slide with the 17 species of bees in Maine?
This slide or like the full list?
I think the full list with the common and scientific names.
Get over there.
Thanks.
I think that one other question we had was from someone who said that they have a native beehive in their barn. They'll probably need to take the barn down, and they want to figure out how to move the hive without hurting the bees. They were just, I think, looking for a resource. Who
it would really depend what kind of bee it was. It sounds like it's probably a colony, so a social colony. So it could be a bumblebee colony, but they don't tend to reuse the same places year after year. So bumblebee colonies completely die out each year. They're annual versus like a honeybee colony. They may have a feral honeybee colony living in their barn. In that case, I would contact their local beekeepers association, which you can find probably through the state of Maine website, the maine.gov, or you could contact the state apiarist, which is Jennifer Lund. But a lot of people will come across like yellow jackets and think that they're bees, and they are not, but yeah.
I'm not seeing, we did have a honeybee question. I know, so someone had asked, they said that they get honeybees at their bird bath and were wondering if putting out sugar water was beneficial or not.
That would be a great question for someone who knows more about honeybees than I do. Having a water source is awesome, especially if you have a water source where you can put down like stones or something so the bees have something to balance on while they drink. I'm not sure that sugar water would be needed if there are other floral resources around. So I'm not sure if this person's asking because they have a beehive themselves, or maybe their neighbor has a beehive so they see these bees visiting. Chances are whoever is taking care of the hive is treating them if needed. So I would think sugar water is not needed.
Probably just the drinking water then. Neat. Somebody just asked, is there still citizen science going on about bumblebees? Are there opportunities to get involved?
Not really with this project. We did stop all volunteer trainings in 2018. So not with this particular project this time. And I'm trying to think if there's anything related at this point. But the closest thing I can think of is the Bird Atlas, which they're still recruiting for.
Okay. I think that might be it for our questions. Really wonderful resources that you've shared. Thank you.
And I will definitely email Becky with anything I think of that I said that I was like, oh, this would be really great. So thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. I will be sending out an email tomorrow with links to the recording, and I've been jotting down notes of all these wonderful resources, so I'll be sending those out as well as linking them to the event page on KELT's website. So you can always visit there if you want to collect those resources. And thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening, and I hope to see you again.